I went skiing and it was absolutely fantastic. It was
I
so
went
nice.
skiing today too.
Were you? Yeah. Well,
Yeah, powder
where
day.
you are, it must be amazing skiing.
Oh, it is amazing skiing. Yeah, we have like, yeah, that's our go-to thing. So I do have this beautiful Algonquin. It's called a Sacred Blend Tea, and it's an indigenous brand. And they have all different kinds of, it's ethically wildcrafted and organically sourced, and it's indigenous. And then we also have, this one's called Sorjesa, and she has a beautiful, you know what, I want to take that blur background off just because it's hard for me to show you my.
Yes, right. Yeah.
Right? How do I do that on my thing?
Let's see. Should be those little three dots in the top right of your own screen. If you click
You're
those,
right.
yeah,
Thank
you should be able to see your filters.
Choose video filter.
Yeah.
Oh,
meanwhile, I have that's a stuffed Spanish Inquisition from the Monty Python doll in my background.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and actually it's interesting. I may bring this up a little bit later, but that painting where my pencil is by a local artist, and it's of the American eel wrapped around a lobster.
Oh, wow.
There's a story apparently behind the American eel and the lobster having a big battle. And the American eel was apparently a thriving species in the Ottawa River. And then, of course, some of the dams were put in. And yeah, the species doesn't come here anymore. So
there you go. Another little story.
Exactly. So we're just letting the final people in and we'll get underway, but I did want to just welcome everybody who is here. We were chatting, Matricia and Lara and I, about how we probably couldn't have planned a better day. So I hope this is an opportunity for everybody to just take a nice breath and sit and listen to some good stories. So on behalf of Tree Fest, welcome. And I would like to say that in Ottawa, where we are, the land that we gather on is the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. And we show and extend our respect for the past and future and current collaborations and contributions of all First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples. We at Tree Fest Ottawa really are dedicated to learning more about our shared cultural histories and Indigenous histories, and we want to share that with you. So I'm really, really happy to be able to introduce this today with our Healthy Woods, Healthy People initiative through Tree Fest Ottawa. This is part of our way of reaching out to our communities, all different kinds of communities, to help us sort of understand each other and to help implement some of the co-stewardship models we know we're going to need for our future. So with great pleasure, I introduce Matricia Bauer. Matricia is a singer and she's a songwriter. She's a musician, a drummer, an artist, and a mother. Together with her daughter, Mackenzie Brown, she is part of the Warrior Women Collective in Jasper, Alberta. And for the past 20 years, she has been sharing her art and her culture with schools, with national conferences, with other groups, and now with us. So Matricia, welcome, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It's always hard for me to hear about myself in those terms, but thank you very much. And I'm really excited to be here. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about as an Indigenous person, as a woman, as a dendrophile, as a botanist, as an herbologist. And so all of those things bring me great pleasure. And I'll kind of explain to you why those things matter to me so much. So in my language, Iskato Chitawa Chinitsigatsono Chinia Jasper. So I have two names, my English name, which is Matricia Bauer, and then my Cree name, which is She Who Moves Mountains. And so I hail from Jasper, Alberta, but my band is Sturgeon Lake Cree Nation, which is about 5 hours north from here, maybe 6, depending on how fast you drive. And I'm delighted to talk about the flora with you. So I have two primary experiences that I host here in Jasper. So I work in tourism, and we've been pretty hard hit over the pandemic, but normally we have about 2.1 million visitors that come through Jasper, and we're a small town. We only have about 5,000 people, but we have a huge, huge area. We're one of the biggest national parks in North America. And so we have a huge flora area that is primarily subalpine. And so it kind of crosses into the boreal as closer you get to BC, the warmer weather, but for the most part, it's subalpine. And then of course, with the mountains on the top of the mountains, it's alpine. And then we have this beautiful valley flora. So there's two experiences that I do. One is a fireside chat, and the other one is a Wapaquanis plant talk and takeaway. So the Wapaquanis plant talk and takeaway is seeing the flora through an Indigenous lens. And so I kind of want to take you on a virtual plant walk and talk a little bit about some of the stories that have motivated me. Right away, I put in some Indigenous tea companies because they also work in that kind of arena. So this one, the first one's a Sacred Blend. This was the Algonquin Tea Company, and the tea that I'm drinking today has white pine, sweetgrass, and sage. So it has two of our sacred medicines and then one of our tree medicines in it, and that's the Algonquin Tea Company. And then I follow this Indigenous subscription box. And one of the things that I received in it was this ASCII tea, and it has white willow. And so it's 1 teaspoon of white willow. White willow is quite medicinal. It's actually our aspirin. So it has a pain reliever in the willow. And then the other one is sargassum, and sargassum has blueberry and all different kinds of black teas, but all different kinds of medicinal teas as well. So if you want to support Indigenous people through economic reconciliation, by all means, go to those websites and take a look and treat yourself to some beautiful tea, or maybe treat a friend to some beautiful tea, and also get some of that medicine in you as well from the trees that they're able to provide. So one of the first things that I wanted to talk to you about is the creation story, because it's so important for us to understand our creation story and how the trees came to be in our culture. So our culture starts with Star Woman. So actually our word for a chakosak is our word for star, a chakosak, and our word for spirit is a chak. So it's literally a piece of the star. And the reason why we have that word for spirit is because we believe we came from Star Woman. So Star Woman roams the sky. She takes care of the constellations. She takes care of the stars. And in our culture, we have more than one celestial being. We have the creator, we have Spider Woman, we have Star Woman, we have a Wiskia, all sorts of beings in the star world. And in this particular case, Star Woman is the feature of our story. And she could see through the hole in the sky, which we call Pisik. It's a constellation as well. And she could see through that hole in the sky. She could see that planet with all the life on it. And the life at that time was the swimmers and the crawlers, the four-legged, the winged ones, all this life. And they were all swimming around in water, and she asked the creator, she said, I want to go to that planet with all the life on it. And the creator said, I can't help you with that venture because I'm too busy creating. But I'll tell you what, I can take you to Spider Woman, and she can help you with that quest. And so Spider Woman, with her spidery legs, spun a piece of cording all the way down to the eski, and we call that the umbilical cord. And Star Woman followed that all the way to the earth. And when she landed on the earth, she became the Nihiwak, she became the people. And when she left the heavens, she took seeds from the tree of life. And she took seeds from the ground around the tree of life. And she brought in one pocket, she brought all the seeds for the sacred medicine. She brought the seeds for the cedar, for the sweetgrass, for the sage, for the tobacco. And in the other pocket, she had all of the seeds that give us sustenance. She had the corn, she had the squash, she had the peas, she had the seeds for all of the things that we eat, the flowers and the trees. And when she landed on the turtle's back, there wasn't much ground to plant the trees and the seeds. So she had to create the earth on the back of the turtle, and she used the animals to help her with that. And I wish I had more time because we could talk about that creation story as well, but we don't have time. So she created the earth, created this big landmass. We call it Turtle Island because it was built on the back of a turtle. And she took all of those seeds that she had and she spread them all over the ground, and they create the flora that we see today. And that flora is really important because as hunters and gatherers, as foragers, and for food sovereignty, you know, we've only had pharmacy and supermarkets for the last couple hundred of years. But before that, for 10,000 years, Indigenous people have been foraging, have been harvesting, have been growing, and healing themselves with what they found in the forest. And so we still do that to this day. I still gather my sweetgrass. I still gather my sage. Actually, I gather a lot. I gather willow, and I gather spruce tips, and I gather juniper tips and juniper berries and rose hips. And I can't go into, if I was to take you over to my kitchen, you would just see jars and jars of things that I've collected. One of the things I collected this year is, and made, is this is called bark bitters. So I've taken white willow, birch, and cinnamon, and I've created an elixir with alcohol. So this is distilled, and eventually this will become a bitter that I can just add to water. I can add to teas, mocktails, cocktails, and I can even season my food with it. So this gives me food sovereignty because this was free. This was freely given by the Creator to us. And it was just the time for me to harvest it and curate it and process it. And we found an arrowhead about, not me personally, but an arrowhead was found about 20 years ago on the Overlander Trail, which is not very far from where I live, about 20 kilometers. And they time dated that to be about 8,000 years old. So that means Indigenous people have been passing through this valley for almost 8,000 years. And just to put that in perspective, that's older than the Roman Empire, and it's older than the pyramids of Egypt. That's how long Indigenous people have been here. So we have this great history on the land, and we've been curating, harvesting, and foraging. And I wanted to talk to you a little bit about all of that today. So I'm just going to keep a mind on the time and make sure that I'm hitting everything that I want to. So as a botanist and as an herbologist, I'm really interested in how the flora talks to each other. And so one of the things that I learned about in the last couple of years is this beautiful Myocarizo fungal network. And so basically the trees talk to each other, and I call that the wood wide web. And it's just it's this wonderful way that the Myocarizo fungal network works. Is it basically attaches itself to all of the roots of the trees, and it creates like a web, and then the trees talk to each other. I think scientifically this is a great discovery because it puts, Susan Samar discovered this about 20 years ago, and she's a UBC professor, University of British Columbia, and has done an enormous amount of work in this particular area. But basically, she's put in scientific words what Indigenous people have known for thousands and thousands of years. So I think that because Indigenous people are so tied to the land, so tied to the animals, and so tied to the flora, simply because they had to be in order to survive. To put this into perspective, I was walking with my uncle down our dirt road, and he often took me for walks. And we were walking down this dirt road down Edson, Alberta. And he said, well, we better turn back because it's going to rain. And I took out my iPhone and I checked my weather app, and I said, no, there's no rain that's predicted today. And 10 minutes later, it started to rain. And I asked my uncle after, I said, how did you know it was going to rain? And he said, well, because the trees turned their leaves. And so what happens when it rains is the trees get prepared. They can feel the humidity in the air, and they prepare their leaves to have the water run down the core into the root system. And they can help that, right? And there's two sides to a leaf. One side that takes the energy from the sun and changes it into nutrients, but the other side doesn't. And one of the only flora in the entire world that collects chlorophyll from both sides is actually in the sea, right? It's the kelp. Kelp is one of the only flora in the entire world that actually absorbs chlorophyll from both sides, from the sun's energy. So most trees only collect it from one side. And so it's important for that leaf to be facing the sun. The only time that leaf turns away from the sun is when it knows rain is coming, so that it can take the rain apart. So then you see the light part of the leaf instead of the dark part of the leaf. So this is a really good lesson for me, because I was born in an era where instead of watching the flora around me for signs, I was used to watching electronics and the TV and getting my information from sort of a scientific vein. But even science at that time didn't know what my uncle knew intrinsically by being out in the forest. And because he was a traditional hunter, he had spent so much time outside, he was really careful about watching for signs like that, because it meant that he may or may not survive. If it was wintertime and a blizzard was coming, if it's winter and he could freeze, if he needed to start a fire, to get him through the evening, whatever happened, he had to make sure that he was watching what was happening outside. So I think all of those things kind of woke me up in a way that I wasn't always prepared for before. It's interesting for me when I think about pharmacy, or I think about the grocery store. Even 100 years ago, we weren't going to the grocery store for our greens. We were going outside into our gardens, or we were foresting in the forest. So even the way that Indigenous people think about flora compared to how we think about flora today is different. So even in our language, so our word for tree in English is tree. It's a noun. And when we think about a tree, we think about whose tree. And maybe we don't think about whose tree right away until that tree falls over and wrecks somebody's roof. Then it's who's liable for that, who's gonna pay for that tree, who takes that tree down. There's all these sort of liability issues, and that's how we think about trees in sort of like a Western ideology. But from an Indigenous point of view, the word tree is called mystique. And we actually don't even just call it mystique. We call it musha mystique, because mystique just sort of means plant spirit. And musha mystique means like grandfather plant spirit, because the trees are bigger than the rest of the flora. So we actually give our trees a personification. We give them lineage. We give them parentage. We give them ancestry. And it's not so easy to cut something down that's got a longer spirit than you do, that has spirit, that's a grandfather, that's part of your life, that's part of your existence. And we used to have a beautiful tree in our backyard. And as my kids were growing up, I used to tell them, go out and talk to Musha Mystique. Go out and talk to the tree, because we know the tree in Indigenous culture as the ground sees everything and hears every speak. So if you tell it or it'll hold all of your secrets for you. So if you're ever bursting to tell something, then you can go and tell a tree, and a tree is going to keep all of your secrets for you. And most of the trees that are around us are older than we are. And my elder, Frida Maynard, she said to me the trees are a lot older than we are. She said, you know, trees live to be like 100, 200, 300 years old. She said, and we think that we're cutting down the trees and using the trees, but she said, we die before a lot of those trees die. So she said, did you ever think that maybe the trees are composting us? And it's just a different way of thinking of that flora and the way we coexist in our world, because we all return to the earth and we all become nutrients, and the circle of life happens a lot faster for us than it does for the trees, which live to be 100, 200, and 300 years old. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the cedar tree, because the cedar tree is what we know as the tree of life. So the cedar tree is one of the trees that's revered throughout Turtle Island, but primarily on the West Coast. They use it for their totem poles, they use it for their canoes, they use it for their lodges, they use it to weave beautiful hats, and I've seen beautiful baskets and even cedar earrings and jewelry and bracelets and barrettes. So the cedar is used in all those different ways, but in our culture, in Cree culture, we actually have to trade for the cedar. So here in Jasper, in the subalpine forest, we aren't conducive to growing cedar. So cedar grows in the boreal forest, which isn't very far away from us. It's only about 80 kilometers. So as you're driving to BC, the flora really changes. So we often go out to the BC area to collect our cedar. And we use cedar for a lot of things here in the Cree. So the Cree use the cedar for tea. We use the cedar for smudging. We use the cedar for its antibacterial and antimicrobial properties. So traditionally cedar, we use cedar actually in our culture right now for saunas. We use it for siding. We use it for cedar balls in our closets. And the reason why is because of its super high antibacterial and antimicrobial properties. So cedar, the mice and the mites don't like it. So this was something that, and they don't like mint either. So we would mix mint and cedar together. And I come from the prairie regions, so I'm a prairie Cree, and we lived in teepees. So there is no locked door or sealed walls. So you're fairly open to the environment. So other animals will want to come into your environment when it's warmer. And in order to keep them away from coming in, we would put cedar and mint under our mats all around the outside and in our bedding. And that keeps the mice and the mites away. And that's the reason why we still use cedar balls and cedar hangers in our closets today. And the reason why it's used in saunas, because it has such a high oil content to it, which is, I was talking to Laura earlier about cedar tea, and you do have to be a little bit careful how you brew it, because it does have it can be kind of toxic if you brew it too long and, or aggressive in the way that your digestive system handles it in ingestion. So it's not always, it is an excellent tea to drink and it is really beneficial for you, but you do have to be a little bit careful how long you steep it. You don't need very much cedar, and just until it starts turning green, and then you can actually take the cedar out of it and just drink the water. But it is a good one for cleaning you out because of its antibacterial and antimicrobial properties. We also use, so we not only use cedar for making a tea, I use cedar in my bitters as well. And I also soak my hands in cedar. So cedar is really good for healing. So achy joints, any kind of inflammation, pain. So not only is it really good for boiling on the stovetop, but you can also add it to your bath water. And cedar water, if you put cedar on your stove and boil it, it's really good for taking viruses out of the air. And so, of course, we're in a viral pandemic right now. And so for keeping your home clean, you can boil cedar on the stovetop. And you know, cedar is as easy as going outside and harvesting it from the tree. And it gives us all of these potent beneficial properties. And that's just one out of thousands and thousands of trees that we use. The next tree I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was the this one that I have here is the white willow. So when I was talking about the white willow before for its medicinal properties, not only does it come curated in the form of a tea, and literally the only thing that's in this tea is white willow, but white willow is really great to drink throughout the day. And white willow has a beautiful salicylic acid, and that's basically the main ingredient for aspirin. So it is a headache reliever, it's a pain reliever, and you can drink it throughout the day, and it just helps strengthen your system because of that. And so white willow is one of those things that we use a lot in that particular aspect. So my house also smells great, by the way, because I've got boiling cedar and brewed white willow tea. Yeah. There's something else I had. Oh yeah, I wanted to tell you, I wanted to talk to you about this beautiful legend that also talks about the tree. And this is one of my favorite legends. My daughter, when she was growing up, started playing the Indian flute. And the Indian flute is a little bit different. It has it's a tonic, a 5-note scale, and it's just got you play it from the top down. It's a beautiful sound, and a lot of the flutes are made out of cedar. And she had a beautiful cedar flute. We met a flute player that gave us some lessons and gave us protocol in playing the flute, and told us this beautiful legend about the flute. And so there was this young man who was very much in love with a young woman from his tribe. And she was a little bit higher stature than he was. She was probably the daughter of a chief or a medicine woman, and he wasn't in the same sort of status. So he had to work a little harder at getting her attentions, but it didn't matter what he did. She just didn't have the time of day for him. He would bring her the best ponies and the best meat. He would sing her the most beautiful songs, and he would bring her the most beautiful flowers, and he would find beautiful shells down on the beach. And it just didn't matter what he did. He just couldn't seem to win her affection. And he really thought about what it is that he wanted to try and say to her, but he just couldn't find the words. So every day he would go out and he would talk to Musha Mystique, and we know that's grandfather tree, and there's a big cedar tree out in the forest, and he would go out and he would tell the cedar tree all of his problems and all of his secrets. And he just said, you know, I love this maiden so much, and there's so many things that I want to tell her about myself, but I just can't. I get so tongue-tied. And he said, I have this beautiful song that I've been thinking about. And he whistled this beautiful song, and he said, I just wish I could sing this to her, but every time I get close to her, my lips get tongue-tied. You know, I can't seem to whistle in front of her. I get too nervous. And he said, and I just can't seem to attract her attention this way. And in that cedar tree was a woodpecker. And this woodpecker was listening to his story. And between the woodpecker and grandfather Mystique, they came up with the solution. The woodpecker says, you know, I think I can help you. And so the woodpecker spent about 20 minutes carving something out of the tree. And he took one of the branches and he carved some holes, and he carved a whistle at the top. And when he was done, this beautiful flute fell out of the tree, and as it came down, the wind whistled through it, and it made this beautiful sound. And the young man was so taken with the sound that when he lifted it up and he put it to his lips, he could hear the sound playing out of the flute. And when he put his fingers over the holes, they made different tones. They made different pitches. And so he practiced the song that he had wrote, and he practiced it and he practiced it. And he went back, and by this time it had already gotten dark and it was starting to get late, but he sat around the maiden's teepee and he played the song. And pretty soon she peeked out of the flap, and he played the song again. And pretty soon she was standing beside him, and he played the song again. And pretty soon she sat down beside him, and she fell in love with him because of the flute. And that's our legend, is how the flute came to be. It's a beautiful Sakihito story. It's a beautiful love story, and it involves the tree as well. Yeah. I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I have some time to take a few questions now, and then we can wrap up with another legend in a bit. How does that sound?
That sounds great, because there was a question in the chat. And so if anybody does want to turn their audio on, I'll let everybody unmute. If anybody does have some questions, you can always just raise your hand to unmute. But one question that was in the chat was, which parts of the cedar do you use for the tea? Is it just is it the little cones? Is it the branches? Is it the bark?
So that's a really good question to ask, and I'm glad you asked it. So it's the green leaves. And so cedar actually looks a lot different than every other evergreen that we have. It kind of has a lung look to it. And so we call it the lung tonic, but it has an interesting looking veiny leaf to it. It's not really a leaf, and it's not really a pine needle. It's quite different. Yeah. And that green part is what we take and what we boil. And you don't need very much, like, you know, like a teaspoon of cedar will do a teapot full, right, if you're boiling a pot full on the stove. And I wouldn't leave it for, you know, more than a day. And if you're leaving it in there to boil for the air, then I would add it to my bath that night, or soak my hands in it, and then, you know, start again the next day. But yeah, it's the leaves that you want to boil, and yeah, the bark and the roots we don't use for the cedar, just the green part of the leaf. So that's a really good question, because with the white willow, we don't actually use the leaves. We actually use the willow, and we often scrape the green part out, and you're left with the inside bark, and that's what's used for your tea. And then you can just cut it into you can cut it into about 1-inch pieces, and those pieces can then be put into an industrial spice grinder. I have a heavy duty industrial spice grinder, but because you're probably going to wreck your coffee grinder by putting willow in there. Yeah, you'd have to cut it up into you can cut it up, and my one friend cuts her willow up into discs. And so you only need about 3 discs to make a cup of tea with, but you can cut it up into discs. But I actually like to grind mine. And I think this willow tea, I'll just open this up. I'm pretty sure this is probably ground willow tea, like I grind mine. Yeah, so you can see how this bark is ground up.
Oh, okay.
So that's commercial, and I'll show you mine.
Yeah, the other thing too is, I mean, we have cedar trees in, you know, nearby woods in Carlington, but we also have a lot of cedar hedges, right? So that can grow into trees. Sorry.
Yeah. So this is the white willow. So this is the white willow bark, and you can see, I mean, it looks exactly the same as the purchased white willow. And so it kind of has this sort of sawdusty look to it. But yeah, I just grab and drop into my tea. But yeah, it has quite a bit of sediment. So some people like to bag it, which you can bag it if you want. I usually just strain it in a strainer. So I actually don't, you can see that this particular one has a straw hole in it. I don't like to, I kind of don't always make sure that my barks, you can see this has almost got like some sediment to it, but I like to keep it a little bit dry, so I don't always jar it completely tight. Yeah. Good question. Really good question. Yeah.
And what about drying things? Like, does that, you know, usually fresh is best, but I mean, for longevity, I mean, certainly maybe not cedar, but for some of the barks, you know, I could see, you know, if they were dry.
So one thing that I harvest a lot are the spruce tips, juniper tips, and pine tips. And they have quite a bit of, like, they don't have the tannic acid in them yet. So they're very sort of lemony tasting, and they're kind of like, that has all of the embryonic nutrition that the tree has for the year. So there's you know, we do have, actually, this is a great time to talk about Indigenous protocol. So when I'm picking there's a couple of things that you do have to be sort of really aware of. And you can look this up on wild crafting, and most harvesters will have like a code of conduct. But in Indigenous protocol is we always lay down tobacco. So tobacco is the gift that the Creator gave us. And in exchange for what I'm taking from the forest, I lay down tobacco. I never take more than what I need personally, or what I'm gifting. So when I'm harvesting, I would never harvest close to a road or a railroad or to even a municipal area. I often go a little bit further into the forest, just so that, trees are a beautiful addition to the municipality. They absorb emissions and, trade it basically for oxygen, which is a lovely sort of symbiotic way that we exist with the trees. But I don't want to be necessarily harvesting from the trees that have been collecting those emissions, right? So I'm going to go a little further into the forest, and I'm going to find trees that are a little further away from the roadway or from the railway or from the municipality. And that's where I'm going to be doing my harvesting. And I never, I call them children trees, call them teenage trees, and I call them adult trees. I usually don't ever harvest from a child tree or a teenage tree. I harvest from a good, healthy adult tree, and I never harvest more than 20% of the tree. Even when I'm doing my regular picking, like my sage or my sweetgrass, and if they happen to be in seed, I never take the seeds with me either. I don't need those seeds. Those seeds need to stay there in the ground for next year, so that there's that patch, right? So I don't want to harvest everything.
Exactly.
I need to keep some there for next year, so that it's there for other people, so that it's there for next year, so that it's there for other generations. And that beautiful harvest that I keep, then I realize I'm just using what it is that I need.
Yeah.
And so that kind of protocol is really important when we're talking about harvesting and wild crafting and sustaining. And so when I'm gathering my tips, I'm gathering juniper tips, I'm gathering spruce tips, and I'm gathering, you can gather pine tips and fir tips. They're all very good. They're very high in vitamin C. And one of the things that a lot of the first Europeans were experiencing when they came over to Canada is we didn't have, figs. We didn't have limes and lemons and oranges and grapefruits. And so they were really lacking in their vitamin C. Almost all of them were experiencing a high degree of scurvy. But we have tons of vitamin C in our flora. It's just that you have to know where to find it. And one of the sources that we have is in these beautiful tips, and they're lemony, and you can roast them, you can dry them. And because there's only, yes, and pickle them. And because they're only here for a specific season, a lot of what I do come the spring and the summer and the fall is harvesting. And then I dry a lot of my harvest so that I can process it over the winter. So when I'm doing my plant walks are all based seasonally, right? So in the spring, I'm harvesting my rose petals. I'm harvesting my spruce tips and my juniper tips, and drying them and processing. I don't have time always to process. So now that it's winter with all of the snow on the ground, that's when I'm doing my bitters. That's when I'm making my sols. That's when I'm making my syrups and my shrugs and, the different things that I deal with. And in fact, one of the things that I do actually is I curate these little bonsai because so that I can harvest during the winter. Obviously, you're not going to be able to harvest a lot, but the bonsai work really well. I have bonsai juniper, I have bonsai pine, I have bonsai fir, and I have bonsai maple.
Nice.
And these all kind of provide me a little educational component, but they give me that opportunity to like have that great. And you can already see my bonsai. Do you see how they're already producing their little tips?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's a little bit early.
Right.
I kind of gave him some fertilizer and I think he got all excited.
We've got a question here. I may be able to help with this too, but do you have any contacts for Algonquin herbologists or botanists, that would be in our area?
So I would contact the Algonquin Tea Company. So it's the algonquinteacompany.com.
All right.
And I mean, if you're looking specifically for Algonquin, the Algonquin Tea Company, like their curators, they're all organic and wildcrafted and ethically sourced. So they're going to know exactly what it is that you need.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. And I mean, I've done foraging as well for those, and I do have a list of the ethical wildcrafting rules, which Matricia, you did get into a little bit, but there's a lot to keep in mind and to bear in mind. So yeah, so anybody who's interested in that, get in touch with me afterwards and by email, and I can send that to you.
Yeah, and like it was interesting for me to like read that because that's part of my heritage already. So that's something that we get taught when we're really small, but like it doesn't matter which knowledge keeper or elder or plant woman that I talk to, we all have the same like protocol that's necessary. In fact, there's been so many times where we'll be out picking something and I'll be like, do you have the tobacco? No, I don't have tobacco yet. But we always carry tobacco with us. Yeah. And in that way. And I think part of that sovereignty of like harvesting or wildcrafting is just this ability to spend time in nature. And when you spend time in nature, you grow an appreciation for it as well. And there's nothing that feels as good as a harvest, so like going out and being able to collect, my, the different parts of the tree. Sometimes I collect pine cones and I can collect birch bark and make a flour out of birch bark. And we have birch bark cookies. And in fact, I used to collect so much birch bark and make it into flour. So birch bark flour, it's the orange part on the underneath on the bark, and you literally can just take it and grind it. And then you add 1/4 of birch bark flour to 3/4 of regular flour. So my daughter brought home this cookie from school and it was perfectly white. And she said, look, they have white sugar cookies. And I said, well, we can make white sugar cookies too. And she said, but all our sugar cookies are red. And I said, that's because I use birch bark, because I've been using birch bark and making these red cookies. So it doesn't really make a difference when you're making a gingerbread cookie, but it definitely makes a difference when you're making, a bread or you're making a sugar cookie. And birch bark lends itself particularly well to a sugar cookie because it adds that little bit of sugar in there. But the birch bark also lends itself really well to the gingerbread. It pairs very well with cinnamon, which is, also a bark. So I think that makes sense to me. Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions?
Nothing else has come in, I don't think. I don't see anybody's hand up.
Okay,
yeah.
No worries. If you find that you have a question, just throw it into the chat.
Yeah. And
otherwise,
I'm keeping an eye on the chat too, so yeah.
Otherwise, I'll continue. So I know I had talked a little bit about the Myocarizo fungal network and how the trees talk to each other. But in our indigenous culture, we have known that for a long time. And so when the trees talk to each other, what are they talking about? Well, they're talking about all sorts of different things. They're trading knowledge, they're trading history, they're trading nutrients like phosphorus and oxygen and water. And the most interesting thing to me is not only do the deciduous trees talk to the coniferous trees, they don't just talk to only the trees in their neighborhood or in their family, which they do, but they also talk to the other trees outside of their family. So here in Jasper, right now, the coniferous trees are well, you can see even my little, they're going to be starting to bud here pretty soon. They're starting to, produce their tips. And so they need a little bit more, like they're using that extra energy that they're collecting. But pretty soon the deciduous trees are going to be producing their buds, and they're going to need a little bit more help. So the coniferous trees are going to say, hey, you know what? we've been working all winter, collecting our chlorophyll, collecting our oxygen, collecting our water. We're going to give you some extra to help you out. And then the deciduous trees in the fall lose their leaves. So they show us how beautiful it is to let go. And in doing that, they have extra nutrients. So then they then trade it to the coniferous trees in return to help them through winter, because they go into stasis. So this beautiful symbiotic trading of nutrients happens all through the Myocarizo fungal network, which is basically the mycelium. It's the fungi. Fungi do that. The mushrooms. Well, I don't have time to get into mushrooms today because we're talking trees. So I'm going to continue with the trees. But I wanted to talk to you a little bit about all the different parts of the trees that we harvest. So depending on what kind of tree it is that you're collecting from, we also collect roots. Some of the different trees that we collect from, we collect the bark. We also tap the roots. So Indigenous people were the first ones to start tapping the roots for maple. And we use maple in our blueberries. We collected it for a very long time, especially in the Quebec region. And my ancestors came from the Quebec region over to the Prairie region. So I have some of that French and English in my heritage as well. And they were the first ones to tap the maple tree. So we use the syrup as well. And you can actually tap birch trees. So I don't know if anybody has had a chance to ever tap birch trees, but birch water is supposed to be one of the best that you can use for sort of re-strengthening your system, kind of like a Gatorade, but without all of the fake sugar and nutrients. So okay, good for you, Gatorade. Yeah. I think one of my favorite ways of getting tree medicine into my system is 100% the teas. And one of the reasons why it is because it's so simple. And just by using water and boiling it and then adding the plant matter to it, that's as simple as a tea can get. But there's a couple of things that I've learned about my tea making process. One of them is you always want to boil the water, but I never want to add the boiling water right to the plant matter. I want to give it just a second, like 20 seconds, just to stop actually from a rolling boil, because that can actually scorch the leaves. So depending on what it is that you're using, if you're using leaves, they can get scorched fairly easily, which is why a lot of people, when they drink green tea, find it very bitter. That's because their water is actually just a little bit too hot. So if you just wait a second, add your hot water to your tea. And then a lot of people, if you're using your leaves from your tree matter, your plant matter from your trees for medicinal purposes, you usually have to steep it for a little bit longer. So when we brew like an English tea, that's already been processed. So it doesn't take very long for it to extract. But when we're using white willow or osha root or mugwort or Labrador tea, we have to let it steep a little bit longer. And that's anywhere from 6 to 10 minutes. And that will actually extract the medicine out of the leaves, out of your tree matter, out of your plant matter. And that's when then you can drink it. And often they'll be a little bit bitter, which is why when we're picking our leaves and trees, it depends on when it is that you want to harvest. So for willow, we usually collect willow in the winter. It's had a chance to caramelize, same as rose hips, who want to wait till after the first frost, they'll be sweeter. So knowing when to harvest, and of course, spruce tips, pine tips, juniper tips, and fir tips, you have to pick those just before the brown shell falls off. So a lot of the tips will come out and they won't have, they'll have a brown shell on them. So I was talking about the Europeans and scurvy. But one of the things that the Indigenous women did for the Europeans when they first came over is not only did they meet them, they healed them, they met, and they married them. So they healed them by understanding the flora that was already in our system here on Turtle Island, and using them for teas and curing the men of their scurvy and of other ailments as well, because they had other ailments like toothaches and different aches, and they were able to find the medicinal things in our flora here, because they didn't have the ability to bring everything over them from Europe. And you didn't have the ability to go onto Amazon or go to your local pharmacy or go to your local superstore to extract what you needed. You had to know what it was within the flora to heal yourself. And with tree medicine, we have that ability. The other thing that we harvest a lot from the trees is sap. So sap is most easily harvested in the early frost because it's hard. If you gather it in the summer, it's going to be sticky. It's going to be a mess. I always make sure that I use a container that I'm not going to use for anything else. So like an old Tupperware container. But it's really nice to keep your saps in the freezer so that they remain hard. But yeah, I've gathered a lot of saps in my time, and saps have a lot of nutritional value in them as well. We used to chew a lot of sap when we were young. It's really good for your teeth. It's really good for your gums. It's really good for pain relief as well. And the longer you chew it, the better it gets. So lots of people will put sap in their, will chew on sap and be like, oh, it tastes terrible. And I'll be like, no, keep chewing. And eventually it gets to a point where it's more palatable. But if you don't know it at first, it can be very sticky mess at first. Yeah, but sap can be as easy as tapping the trees, and then later in the fall, it can be a harder structure. Yeah.
You reminded me of my high school environmental studies teacher who took us out, and we were harvesting, the sap that was coming off of some of the spruce trees. And he told me the exact same thing. It's just like, but it's breaking up. Just keep chewing. It will come together. Yeah.
Yeah, it eventually gets, there's always that initial, you can always tell people who have never had it before because it's almost in their face. The expression is like, this does not feel right. But yeah, it's one of those things you just sort of have to get through, and then eventually it becomes more palatable. Yeah. Laura, was there anything that out of any of the topics that I was sort of talking about that I should expand on, or that you had any questions about?
I actually had a bit of a question. You piqued my curiosity, if I heard right, you said something about tapping roots. Is that true? Like tapping? Okay.
Yeah, no. So
okay.
No, we don't tap roots. Just tapping the birch tree. Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought you said.
Yeah. And the one thing that I learned about tapping is you don't need a very big space, and you can actually get quite a bit of from a birch tree. And we don't have any birch trees here in the national park, but the further you go outside of the park, we do have some birch trees. And I have a friend of mine who taps her birch trees, and she gets an enormous amount of liquid from her birch trees. So it's quite impressive. And it doesn't seem to harm the trees at all. She puts a plug back into it, and just like that, it manages to renew itself. So it's another one of those resources that the Creator has provided to us. And she does the same, offerings. She offers her tobacco. And I'll tell you a story about my elder, Dorothy from Hinton. Her son was quite sick. He was actually experiencing cancer, and she had come out, was doing some learning. We were both educators at the Palisades, and she wanted to go for a drive to do an offering. And so she asked me if I would drive her out to the forest to do an offering. And we drove for quite a while, and she said, stop here. So we stopped at a particular sort of it was like a little pasqua, a little meadow. And she found a tree that she liked, and she had made soup at home. And so she went and offered the soup to the tree. And she stayed there for quite a while, about 15 minutes, to say her prayers and talk to the tree. And for the whole time, she had her hands on the tree, talking to the tree and spending that moment. But I had never in my life seen anybody give a tree offering before. And I asked her what the food was for, and she said that food was for the tree spirits. Now, I wouldn't propose that everybody go to the national park and put soup under the tree. It would probably be a bear attractant. But in this particular instance, it was a beautiful moment that, you know, I knew she had thought about the soup that she was making, and she had made this soup because she knew that it was going to be an offering, and she was feeding the spirit of the tree. And it just felt very sacred. It felt very special. It felt very kind of bittersweet in a way, you know, her asking for, you know, this help. And I think that when Indigenous people didn't have any more control over the things that they were experiencing, they reached out to the greater forces at hand. And in this particular instance, she was talking to the tree spirits and the creator in that way, and offering her that offering. And you have to think back in the day when people were starving, this would have been such a gift to give away food, you know, to give something that she had cooked. And I think that we had a really great garden, and for whatever reason, I don't even, you know, I don't have a great fondness for leeks. I mean, I like leeks, but I planted tons of leeks. And when we were done, we had the most bumper crop of potatoes that we'd ever had, and tons of leeks. And I said, well, how are we going to preserve all of these? And so we decided to make a big batches of leek soup and keep them in our freezer. And the other day, you know, we've gone through this horrific cold snap, and I was able to, you know, get out this bag of leek soup, and it was just like summer had visited us, you know, this harvest and all this time that we had taken, you know, for our own potatoes and our own leeks, and we made this soup, and it was so good. And it just reminded me how simple it can be to provide my own food, and how lovely it is to sort of have the sovereignty to gather and plant my own food. And I just found that was really gratifying. And I think that when you have to go out to the forest and you're picking your soap berries, and you're picking your rose hips, and you're picking your acorns, and you're picking your leaves, and you're picking your barks, and you're picking all of these things that you're going to, you know, make things with and harvest and eat with, it's hard work, but it makes you so proud when you're done, and it doesn't cost you anything but time. And I know that time is something that we're all limited with, but I think that where you spend your time is really important too. And for me, I spend my time in these particular areas because it is important to me as well. So I wanted to tell you as well, anybody that's on the Zoom call, you can ask me anything about my Indigenous culture. It doesn't just have to be about trees, although of course it is the Tree Fest, so this is where my topic lies. But I find that lots of people don't always have access to an Indigenous knowledge keeper, or somebody that works in the Indigenous education area like I do. So if you've always had a question that you've wanted to ask an Indigenous person but was afraid, now would be a really good time.
Well, I'll do that.
Okay.
And if anybody else wants to, please feel free to either put it in the chat or raise your hand. But, you know, you talk about, you know, and we know about the offering of tobacco and the offering of the soup. I've always sort of looked at it for my own self, because I am a forager and a naturalist, I do a thank you in my head. You know, so I feel that I'm still meeting that spirit. I may not be giving a physical thing back, but I stop and I at least talk to the plant. You know, it's like, hey, how you doing? Because that's who I am, right? And I don't come from a culture of, you know, like my parents were British, they lived in London, you know, not exactly great foraging territory, right? I don't come from that. So for me, it's a personal thing that I have a relationship with this plant, whether I'm picking it or just studying it. So
Yeah.
even if it's not for edible purposes, I still have that sort of mindset when I go out and I look at things.
Yeah. You know, I took this interesting course. It was from like, I can't remember the name of but it was online and it was during COVID, and it was all on sort of appreciating the flower. And so you had to go and buy a flowering plant, and it had to be a specific plant because it had to be an edible plant. Mine, I bought a poppy. Was it a poppy? No, it was a pansy. Sorry, it was a pansy. And pansies are edible, and it was a purple and yellow pansy. And there was homework that we had to do with every single segment. And it was actually really interesting because we had to like talk to our plant every day. And I don't know, like I believe that there's tree spirit. And during COVID, I would go talk to my tree, and I would tell my friends, you know, if you can't hug each other, hug a tree. So there was all these different things I did, but I never really talked to the plant. So I had to like create a relationship with this plant. And then our other homework was that we had to name the plant and we had to introduce it to our friends. So I was like, driving around, I had to drive around with, one of the things was we had to keep our plant with us 24 hours. So even if we went to the bathroom, we had to like keep our plant where we could see it the entire time. So it was like, I was carrying this plant around with me all day, and my friends would be like, oh yeah, you and your plant. And it felt like such a goof, right? But I was introducing my plant to my friends. I was like, no, it's part of a course. I'm doing this plant. This is my pansy. And I, you know, named my pansy Pat. And so it was Pat the pansy. And I had all of these things that I was doing with this pansy, but I was making friends with the pansy. And we had to like, one of our homework was we had to like paint, draw, or color our pansies. So we had to put it onto paper. And that was really fun because I'm an artist and I was like really into this. And then we had to, and you really have to look at your plant in order to draw it. As an artist, I already am aware of that. And then we had to like write a song to our plant. We had to write a poem about our plant. But the very last day we had to boil water, and we had to eat our plant. And I know this is going to sound weird, but I had a really hard time eating my pansy. Actually, I kind of cried a little bit because I was like, I had curated this stupid plant and it wasn't a stupid plant, but you know what I mean? I felt like the exercise was extremely stupid at times. But by the end of it, I was like so in love with this little plant that I'd spent so much time with that I didn't want to eat it. But there was something when I ate it, it was like this appreciation of this plant. It was an appreciation of plant matter that I've never had before. And ever since I've had a salad or ate a nasturtium or, you know, ate a plant, I think of it differently. I think of it like that pansy. I have a level of appreciation, even though I didn't grow this flower from seed, but it was just an exercise in learning to love that nature around me, even though I'm Indigenous and I already, you know, I know the stories and I know the seeds and I love my plants. This was just a different way of connecting with that flower. And I found it was, it was really interesting. And so just, like that ability to say, you know, thank you for being there. Thank you for being part of nature. Thank you for letting me harvest. Thank you for letting me be part of your culture. You know, it's such a privilege. There's parts of the forest that nobody has ever actually seen or walked through. And so it's so beautiful to walk through those areas and, you know, say, thank you for being here. And I think there's a part of me that never feels quite as alive as I do than when I'm walking through the forest. And I love to give that gift of that time back to myself. Yeah.
Well, on that note, I do have a question here. Here in Ottawa, it's a local issue. We have a red pine forest that is on the chopping block, and somebody's asking, do you have any advice, you know, from an Indigenous First Nations perspective? How do we continue to fight when we're constantly having to fight these battles? But I do have an easier question as well, so you can think on that one. But I've got another one about any local plants that are good for a sleep aid. I know of one in Ottawa that grows.
So pineapple weed or wild chamomile is actually a sleep aid. It works the same way as chamomile does. But yeah, chamomile or wild chamomile. I mean, pineapple weed I hate that word weed, because weed is basically defined as a plant we don't want. And the creators put every plant around us for a reason, except for the time that I thought stinging nettle was wild mint.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was a lesson I had to learn the hard way. But yeah, the pineapple weed grows all over the place, and it's super sustainable, super harvestable, and easy to clean, and it dries and lasts forever. Yeah.
It really
So
does smell like a pineapple, the little blood,
Yeah.
little buds.
And yeah, and you know, and I find like I usually add teaspoon for teaspoon. So if it's a teaspoon of lemon, I add a teaspoon of honey, and even just a lemon and honey tincture, but with the chamomile, that's really going to help. It just settles you down, stops the noise. Yeah. And of course, meditating with your favorite plant. That was the other thing we had to do with the pansy, was we had to meditate.
Now, and what about the harder question? So some advice on, I don't know if you've ever had to be involved in some of these fights. So
one thing I would highly suggest you read is The Woman Who Lived in the Tree. And this is the story about the woman who was not, she wasn't even and I don't know if that's the name of the story, but she was it's a fascinating read, because she wasn't even really an environmentalist, and she just felt like, I think she was a school teacher, and she just felt called to go to the Amazon, and she just climbed up into one of the trees, and she lived there for 2 years. And they made a movie out of her. Oh, yeah. And in fact, they only showed like the like her living in the tree for a year, because even the idea of doing a movie and having her live in the tree for 2 years was too long. She just basically never came out of the tree. And she saved that tree from being clear cut in the Amazon. And they made and they saved some of the mother trees there, because the mother trees are, so basically here in Alberta, we have some of the largest clear cutting in the world, and we have a beautiful tree. And I know I have a, you know, I listened to this podcast. It's called Completely Arbitrary, and they gave the poor pine tree 5 golden acorns out of 10. And I was so sad, because I love the pine tree, and the pine tree here in Alberta is called the lodgepole pine. So any Indigenous person that has ever woken up in a teepee is surrounded by anywhere from 12 to 21 lodgepole pines. And those lodgepole pines are used to hold up our teepees. They're our teepee poles. And of course, when the Europeans came over, they were like, these are perfect for lodges, and they're called lodgepole pine, because they grow fast, and they grow straight, and they grow quite thin and quickly. And so forestry has also discovered this as well. And so what happens is you can go up to Grand Cache, which is about 2 hours north of here. And on one side of the road is all these lodgepole pine. And on the other side of the road is this complete biodiverse complex forest system with tons of different, you know, willow, spruce, pine, all different kinds of flora. And so what has happened here is this side's been logged. This side's been logged for forestry. And then of course they've replanted, but they've replanted with pine. So now but the problem with having a forest that isn't complex and diverse is you have what we call Lord of the Flies, right? So you have a bunch of teenage trees that don't have any lineage, that don't have any history, that don't have any mother trees, that have never learned how to, we were talking about that symbiotic way of sharing and trading nutrients, but they're all the same age, and they're all fighting for the same thing. And there's no other complexity in that particular forest. So they're all growing at the same time, and they're all fighting for the same nutrients. And so they're confused. And so that kind of monoculture is extremely susceptible to things like forest fires, climate change, and infestation. So I don't know if you knew, but British Columbia this year, from all the logging, was under, for the last 2 years, every summer, they have huge forest fires and they go under a state of emergency. We also experienced an incredible heat drought. We've had colder weather than we've ever had and hotter weather that we ever had. And this is climate change. And we're also here in the Rocky Mountains experiencing an infestation called pine beetle. So all of those things that I said about monoculture have already happened here in Jasper. And so the reason why that's so important is because the Amazon, like that woman who climbed up into the mother tree for the Amazon doesn't have the most clear cutting in the entire world. The most clear cutting in the entire world happens 100 kilometers from here in Banff, in British Columbia. And then they do tree plant, but they plant with a monoculture, which is the pine tree. So I love the pine tree because it has a beautiful culture, but we're overusing it and overplanting it. And because we are, Mother Nature is trying to correct it by, I mean, the pine beetle has always been here, but unfortunately, because of the prevalence of the pine beetle, it has morphed and changed. And it's a different pine beetle now than it was 20 years ago. So it's becoming more aggressive, and it's starting to jump into other pine type trees like aspens and birch, which is incredibly alarming and quite scary. So this is just sort of like a causal. I understand. What do we have to do? We have to remember why the forests are there, why they're complex, and why they're biodiverse. And this is in education, and it's not new. This information has been out there for 20 years. Indigenous people have been telling people this for thousands of years, and we have found it alarming for many, many years. The only, Canada, Turtle Island is 80% Crown land. Indigenous people who used to live on Turtle Island own one half of 1% of all the land. So we're not on that land anymore, right? We don't have sovereignty over that land, right? It's the Crown. The Crown is owned by the monarchy. It's owned by Canadian citizens. So we do have a say, but the only thing that we can do is we have to get the right people into the right political structure, right? We have to become those teachers and those educators. We have to teach our children why things like Tree Fest are important, why it's important for us not to plant monocultures, why it's important for us to be sustainable, why it's important for us to have complex ecosystems, because those ecosystems are what are going to save us in the future. The trees are what produce the oxygen for us. So if we continue on this path, I know I'm preaching to the converted here.
Yeah.
So how do we bring the people that are outside of our circle into it? Mm-hmm. And we do that through the education system. We have to teach our children. Yeah. Do you guys have any other ideas on that?
Yeah, Lara.
Yeah, actually, that's a perfect segue to the question that I had. Being a mother also of a child and an educator myself, I'm curious about any stories or teachings you've told your children or others that help cultivate a connection to nature or trees. Are there, I'm sure there's a lot, but is there anything that comes to mind that helps children, people develop a special connection, see a connection that you've been trying to tell us about that's beyond just something like material or service generating or whatever, which seems to be the paradigm we often look at trees now, but seeing them a bit more wholly, I guess.
What do they call a group of trees? We call it a stand, right? And there's something beautiful about, people who stand together and trees that stand together, right? And if we can stand it, literally, we can also, stand up for our trees as well. But maybe instead of a tree story, I'll tell you a flower story, which seems to be a great place to start. So how old is your daughter, Laura?
So I'm not muted yet. Got to be careful with that when you have a daughter in your arms. How old are you? Can you say? 6.
She's 6.
She's 6.
Okay, so this story is about somebody who's a little bit older, but my daughter did a vision quest when she was about 16 years old. So you've got about another 10 years. But this one is about a young man who went on a vision quest. And a vision quest is we ask ourselves 3 major questions. We ask ourselves, who am I? What is my purpose? And how do I achieve that? And I ask myself these 3 questions every year at my vision quest. And I don't know if I'm any closer to an answer, but at least I ask myself those questions. So when you're old enough, you can go on a vision quest. And my daughter was 16, so I didn't feel like sending her off to the forest all by herself. So I accompanied her. And there's lots of things that you do. You climb a mountain, you do a vision quest, you do a lot of reading and writing and drumming and singing and different things that, you know, like whatever sort of holistic things that you do. But this story sort of centers around a young man who was doing his vision quest, and it's around the mountain that he climbed. And so the mountain that he climbed was quite a tall one. He had picked a really tall one. And after about 4 hours, he realized he wasn't going to reach the top. And so he found a nice area on the mountain that he could make his where he could sleep, make his fire. And on the vision quest, you don't eat. So it's 3 days where you don't eat. And we just believe that helps in clarity of mind. And so he was quite lonely, but he was making his fire, and he noticed a little flower. And so he started talking to the little flower, and the flower kind of kept him company, and he told the flower what he was doing. And when he went to go to bed that night, he noticed that the flower was shaking. And so he took his hat and he put it over top of the flower so that it would stay warm in the evening. And, you know, the Creator is really closely watching our youth when they take these vision quests, because they're praying a lot, they're drumming a lot, they're doing all of the things that bring the Creator to them. And so they keep a special eye out for him. And he noticed this young man putting the hat over the crocus, this little flower. And the next day he took his hat on, and the little flower wasn't shaking as bad, and he was quite happy. And he put his hat on his head, and he finished walking up the rest of the mountain, and he spent his time on the top of the mountain, and he visited with the eagle, and he talked to the sun, and he drummed some songs, and he said his prayers, and he came back down, and he thought, well, he didn't want to spend the rest of the day walking down the mountain. He knew it was going to take 4 hours. So he decided to stay in the same space. He had made his camp before. It was already set up. It was going to be easy. And he noticed the flower again. And so he talked to the flower about all the things that he had done on that day. And at the end of the day, he thanked the flower for being there for him, for witnessing his visions, and for listening to everything that he had to say. And once again, he put the hat over top of the flower because it was starting to shake in the evening. And the Creator came to him, and he said in his dreams, which is how the Creator talks to us, he said, like, I found it very interesting that you put your hat on that flower. He said, can you tell me why you did that? And the young man said, yeah, well, he said, I just thought that the flower wasn't going to make it through the night. And I had spent a lot of time with that flower, and was concerned that it might freeze up here, you know, in this alpine environment. So he said, I put my hat on there so it would stay warm. And the Creator said, oh, okay. And he said, well, he said, I'd like to give you a wish. You've done a really good job on your vision. You've done everything that I've asked you to do during this vision quest. And he said, and the young man said, well, okay, well, I don't want to take the wish for myself. He said, I want to give it to the flower. And the Creator said, what do you wish for the flower? And he says, well, I wish that the flower would be really bright so that people can see it early in the spring. And he said, and I wish that the flower would be warmer, because it's so tenacious to come out so early in the spring. You know, we do our vision quests in April and May. It's you know, quite it's still got snow on the ground here in Jasper. And these tenacious little flowers peek their head through the snow sometimes and show us their bright colors. And so the Creator said, okay, I will do that. And the next morning, the young man took his hat off the flower, and he was so shocked because it was a bright purple flower. And it was so happy. It was warm. It opened up its petals, and on the inside, it was bright yellow. And it wasn't shaking anymore. And he said, oh, you're not shaking. You're not cold. And the flower said, no, look. have a fur coat on. The creator had created this fuzzy fur coat and had put it on the crocus. So I don't know, this is my plant walk hat that I wear, and there's the crocus there. You can see it's got different beads on the outside than it does on the inside, so that I could show the fur coat. It's got matte beads, and then I use shiny beads on the inside, and it used to have a brighter yellow. I use these neon beads, and it's since faded. I wear this hat a lot in the summer, but for its bright yellow center. But that story is how the crocus came to be. And we also call the crocus in our culture, we call it Pasqua Otzi. So it's actually called the buffalo's belly button. And I know when I introduced myself, I said Iskato Chita what chi Nitsigetson. So my name is She Who Moves Mountains, and this is my belly button. And what we mean by that, I know it kind of sounds funny, but what we mean by that is, like, we aren't really ourselves until the umbilical cord is cut and wrapped up into a knot. And then that separation is when we become a being. And so we believe that everywhere a buffalo calf was born, a crocus grows. So it's called the buffalo's belly button, because it reminds us that the buffalo used to roam in the Pasqua, in the meadows around this area, that where there's millions of buffaloes. And we have a beautiful airfield here, and we go out early in the spring, and it is just covered with crocuses. And it reminds me in sort of a bittersweet way that millions of buffalo used to roam this plains, and the buffalo aren't here anymore. And so that is a story within itself, very similar ecological story to what we're talking about right now with the pine tree. And Crown land is our land, right? Crown land is our land. So those pine trees are our trees. So we have to govern them in a way. We have to hold our politicians responsible for the way that those trees are governed and how they're dealt with. And we also have a responsibility, because logging is such a profitable resource here in Canada. We have to hold our logging industry to the highest regards, and they can't just, we have to make sure that their practices are holistic as well, and not damaging, because there is a way of symbiotically coexisting in our culture, and we have to come back to that and make sure that we're rebalanced. Oh my God, do we only have 10 minutes left?
We do. I was about to jump in and say, we've got 10 minutes left. So,
okay, well,
it's last question time, and, or chat. Anybody who wants to talk, I'm more than happy to, unmute everyone. So,
I just wanted to say thank you, because I thought that was a beautiful story. And I think we need more of those stories, because I think that would change people's perceptions of nature for the better. So yes, thank you.
You'll never look at a crocus the same way.
Right? Yeah. And then that spreads to everything else as well. So no.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so that appreciation of all these small little berries, of all these small little flowers, to the magnificent trees that we have, creates a love of the forest and an appreciation for the medicine. And I think even just making my bitters and making my teas and making my tinctures, making my little elixirs and even my little bonsai, I mean, it's just all it's a constant reminder. And obviously you can see my painting behind me, my friend who's an artist, she's captured some of the most beautiful elements of our environment here in Jasper. And, we have a love and appreciation of our environment around here in the Rocky Mountains, which is 90% of why the people, who love it live here. And I don't know if they always realize that's why they love it, but it definitely adds to that element. And we're always talking about how beautiful the Rocky Mountains are, but that also includes the flora. So, and just that extra level of oxygen that we have in this particular area, our clean air and our clean water is some of the best in the entire world. And we actually have Japanese that come here and they bottle our air. And then when they go back home, they unbottle and smell our air, our beautiful deciduous air that we have here in Canada, because they have such smoggy air in different places that they go back to. So I find that fascinating too.
Yeah. Laura, did you have a question? Laura Chant?
Actually, I'm wondering, in the summertime, I started making, oh my goodness, sumac tea.
Yeah.
And does anybody have any, has anybody tried this?
Yes.
Yes.
Laura, I would be more than happy to take you through that. So, because I'm a huge sumac aid maker.
Yeah, I've tried it. No, what we found was we weren't sure whether or not we should be putting the water on the horns, boiling water, or we should be rinsing it first.
No.
Cold water.
No, the sumac berries, all the flavor is in the outside. If you get them, if you rinse them off, you are going to lose some of that flavor.
But
So
then you have the problem of the worms.
Well, what you need is a clean source, and you actually, to get rid of the worms, is you take 2 of the horns, right? You take 2 of the clusters, rub them together, and the berries fall off. And you just use the berries.
Because what we've been doing is actually, maybe this sounds a little gross, but we do pour the boiling water on top and then we strain it.
Oh, I do not use boiling water. I use cold water and I let it steep in the refrigerator for 24 hours.
Oh, really? Eh?
I find hot water or boiling kills the flavor.
Yeah, and I'll when you had asked about drying, anytime you add heat structure to plant material, you're going to lessen the medicinal value in it.
Yes.
So when it comes to drying, air drying is the best, then dehydrating, and then if you absolutely need to, you can dry overnight very quickly in the oven. But you're going to, those things, the medicinal value is going to go down. And the same thing adds to, like to boiling as well. Like if cold infusion, but that isn't always possible. Like sometimes I need my plant material tomorrow. So I have to like extract it, as quickly as I can. If that's really the case, then I'll use an essential oil only for not for ingestible things, but I'll use one of my elixirs that I've made. So that's the other reason why it's really nice to have that additional plant material in different formats, depending on what it is that you're going to be using it for. So I do a lot of different levels. I freeze, I dry, I can, I pickle, I shrug, and I bitter. So there's lots of different varieties of collecting your plant matter. But yeah, I find anytime you're going to add heat, the more heat you add, the lower your medicinal value is going to be, unless it's like a tea and you're extracting the plant material from it.
Okay, so that's my point. I would like to drink it hot. So you're suggesting then that we make it cold with cold water and then warm it in the microwave?
Yeah.
I wouldn't warm it in the microwave. I don't trust microwaves. They kind of break down the food a little bit differently. I know I'm crazy, right?
No, but
I would boil it on
hot. Yeah.
Okay.
Pauline, did you have a question? I noticed your mic.
No, thank you. I've just been sitting in my kitchen. I've been baking. I made 3 pear pies with cranberries and listening to all of you, and it's been just wonderful, wonderful. So thank you for doing this. It's like sisters all together hanging out on a Sunday afternoon.
You're very welcome.
Yeah. No,
I wish I had some of the pie.
Yeah, Laura, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I made a sumac meringue pie.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Yeah. So that's pretty spectacular because you know what the color is, right? It's a bright red that you get, and it just makes a stunning pie.
Wow.
Yeah.
So one quick question. I would assume that the best time to harvest is in the late summer, sumac?
For sumac, I find the best flavor in Ottawa is certainly around August, September. I find it's really good. And the drier the weather, the better the flavor is too, right? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, does anybody, I've got something in there. Oh, I think somebody had to go. and they were saying thank you.
Oh,
Well, yeah,
that's great.
we're down to just a few more minutes. So if anybody's got any last minute thoughts or a question, or, you know, they want more information on something that I can help out with, or I can get, you know, Matricia to help me out with, I can send it along. But if not, any last thoughts, Matricia? This has been fabulous.
It has.
I think that, I guess as far as last thoughts would just be to explore your surroundings. We have trees that are not indigenous to the land here that are outside, and they just have so many berries, and we have like so many bird strikes because the birds eat the berries in the fall. They get drunk and then they hit the windows, and we had like 26 birds die in like a day. It was like a lot. And you know, I was talking to Parks, I was like, you know, these trees aren't even, you know, indigenous to this area. They shouldn't actually even be here. You know, it's creating this, you know, sort of like imbalance. And then I was like, because it isn't a tree that's indigenous to this area, I don't really know that much about it medicinally. So I started doing research on it. It's unbelievable what I can do with these berries. And so then I started sort of like, you know, like letting the people know here in this area that they could collect the berries and make medicines out of it. And so it actually started like people gathering some of the berries as opposed to like leaving them out there and having them rot and sort of putrefy and affect the local flora, like the local birds here that aren't used to that particular berry and having this reaction to it. So I think just going out into your environment and doing some research, you know, and looking past just past the sort of ornamental value is a big bonus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about foraging, I always say it's just like, because people, they want a Balkan mind meld, right? It's just like, give me all the information all at the same time. It's like, well, nobody learns that way, right? We learn one plant at a time. So plant by plant. Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, even myself, I slow it down. So I only ever do one plant a month. And I really like dive deep into that plant. Like I take the entire month, and everything that I do, you know, like all my plant walks, all of my solves, all my shrugs, everything is based just on that one plant. So that really only gives you 12 plants a year to really kind of dig deep into it. And I just find taking that time is really great. Like it just gives you lots of, you know, there's no rush to get that information.
It's rewarding. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
All right.
And,
well,
talk to your pansies.
Sorry, the websites that you mentioned earlier, are they in the chat at all? Did someone put them in the chat?
They are in the chat, and
Oh,
I'll send the links around to everybody in a follow-up email to everybody who is on here today as well. And yeah.
Yes. Thank you very, very much. It's very interesting.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for coming in on a long weekend here in Alberta. This is called the Family Day weekend, so it's actually a long weekend. And I know that some of you were out skiing and doing winter activities. So thanks for taking part of your day, spending it on Zoom and listening to me talk. But Kinnan Askumten Kwekwa, I'd really appreciate it.
Thank you again.
Such a pleasure. No, thank you.
And I have a website, and my website's warriorwomen.ca. Yep. So you're more than welcome to.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. Everyone have a lovely evening. Go talk to a tree. Yes. Tell a secret to a tree or your deepest, darkest dream or wish. But yeah, have a good evening all, and I'll hope to see you in our parks.
Thank you
so much. It was really wonderful. Yeah, I really loved it. Mm-hmm.